and welcome to our Catch Conversation, an opportunity for two professionals to dialogue about the biggest mental health issues confronting our community. I'm Dr. Lisa Novak, a clinical psychologist who specializes in completing neuropsych assessments by day, and I'm a proud board member of Catch by Night. In asking mental health professionals about the trends that keep coming up in sessions with their elementary and middle school families in particular, one theme rose above all others right now: motivation. I'd like to welcome my colleague, Eric Rovin, a devoted local school psychologist and a friend of Catch. Together, we are going to peel back the layers of this complicated topic and brainstorm ways to support our students, as well as parents and caregivers who are watching their children struggle. Eric, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
This is a big topic for us to tackle here, motivation, but it is something that I think so many have been struggling with, both children and parents alike.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I wanted to start by just asking what you have seen in your school setting with regards to parents coming in and expressing concerns about their children, I think particularly in the remote and hybrid environments, but even now that things are shifting back to in-person.
So I've been in touch with school psychologists all over the United States, and we've all been talking about motivation. And I think we're consistently seeing some of the familiar things across different states and within Illinois and within the North Shore, that the vast majority of students are doing okay considering COVID. But there are some that are having a lot more trouble when it comes to that motivation, attention, sticking to a schedule, and their own emotions. They're acting in a way that's different than they typically would during a normal school year. And that has been common across the country. So, anyone that is seeing that with their child right now, they're not alone. There are a lot of people out there that are feeling very similar. And they're wondering what they could do and how they can help in this situation.
My same sentiment exactly. Even in my clinical practice, that has been one of the primary questions that has kept coming up is, how do I know if this is just kind of typical pandemic lack of motivation or something more? I'm curious, have you noticed a shift since we're now pretty much in 1 year of being sort of under this new guideline? Have you noticed a shift in whether people have sort of found their way and have found strategies that work for them, or are really seeming to struggle more and more as the months go by?
Some are finding their groove, but there are still families out there that are not. It has really disrupted the family, whether it's loved ones losing jobs, being let go, or just working from home. It's a whole new environment, especially when your child is also trying to learn remotely and you're trying to work as an adult. And I feel that keeps changing. As you know, the state of Illinois has changed their protocols as the numbers change, which then changes if employers can have adults back or they have to stay at home. We also have snow days that have interrupted us, like the one today, that I think caused some stress on some families, more so than normal. But yeah, I do think some are finding their groove because they're reaching out to their support systems. And they're getting advice.
That's a huge piece. I think we'll want to dive into that, is where can families and students go when they're struggling? And before we even do that, I feel like it's worth noting something that keeps coming up that I keep thinking about is this idea of connection, and how, so much of our motivation and our drive to be successful and to want to, continue to put in that effort really comes from strong connections that we have. As a clinical psychologist, I think about that therapeutic relationship with the clients that I see, but I also think about the incredible impact for students with teachers, and just not even having been able to build that same type of relationship, and how that just changes the dynamic entirely.
I think many students in the area are fairly lucky in having a synchronous relationship with their teachers. For those that aren't familiar, that means it's live instruction versus an asynchronous, where the teacher might post assignments and then you can go at any point in time and watch video or whatever, but you don't have that connection. And I do find students engaging a lot more with that synchronous connection with their teachers. I haven't seen so much where they're not connecting with their teacher, unless they're in an asynchronous mode. And then you feel like you're just checking things off on a list, trying to get to the end. A mix is good, or a pure synchronous environment have found to be most beneficial.
Absolutely. And a lot of our students around here have been really lucky in that way, which has been different than it has been for so many, definitely. I imagine you hear about that a lot when you're talking nationally to other school psychologists with all different kinds of models.
Yeah, the district I live in is doing an asynchronous model. And so the neighborhood kids, I hear a lot that they're really not connected. They're trying to be done by noon with all their work so they can sit on their laptop while mom and dad finish their work.
Absolutely.
So,
and you get less of that positive feedback, which we know is just so critical for wanting to continue to keep students and everyone really engaged and motivated and excited about the things that they're doing.
Yeah. And as we know, the most effective feedback happens within 1/10 of a second after the action happens. And if you're not live, it's hard to catch that. And it's not the same. It doesn't feel the same. The other thing that I also talk about with parents is that COVID itself, the way that it has occurred, is a traumatic event. And we don't want people reliving these events. I mean, people are traumatized because they had to stay home. And when they go to a store, they have to wear masks. And that's totally different than before. And I think it's important to be aware of the conversations you're having with your child and ask yourself, are these adult conversations? Should my child be worried about these things? Or where does this conversation take place? We really only want to have child-friendly conversations with students or your child. Language matters, and they're listening to everything. So be very cautious. And you know what? We all fumble, but we learn from that. And we know next time I shouldn't be having that conversation in front of my child because honestly, they have no control over the situation. They're a child, and I protect them from everything.
For sure. And I think in continuity with that, just with this idea that we are all going through this traumatic experience together, I think also needs to come an element of recognition that these are not normal times. And so our expectations have to shift a little bit about what we really, can expect of our children and can expect of ourselves even. And I laugh that I remember at the initial quarantine back last March and realizing this was going to be, weeks or months, I was like, oh, this will be a great time to write that book I'm thinking about. And I laugh because, of course, we now know this is not the time to do extras. We're really barely staying afloat and remembering that our children are struggling in that way too. And, I think one important point there is to help parents and caregivers pick their battles with kids. It's one thing if not every single assignment is turned in versus they're not engaging academically at all right now. And how do we find that middle ground and accept that things might falter a little bit, and that's okay. We have to give ourselves a little bit of space to be okay with that. But also knowing that when they're really showing that they're not okay, then we absolutely want to step in and really give them additional support. It's a hard balance to strike.
It is a hard balance. And with people having more anxiety or depression-like symptoms, there's going to be more irritability and more of an inclination by parents and children to react in the moment.
Yes.
And I think reminding yourself to take deep breaths, reminding yourself that you don't have to address everything right then and there. I like to implement, my colleagues call it the Rovin 24-hour rule, meaning if it's something that really upsets you or causes a lot of anxiety, wait 24 hours before addressing it. Make sure you process everything that happened before you address it. Because I know there are stressful times between parents and children and vice versa. And it's important to model for your children that you don't need to be reactive, that you can think about it and then come back in an organized way when your emotions are calmer to then have a discussion with your child and model that for them. That will last them a lifetime, learning how to work with that in stress.
Absolutely. Which, I think that's part of this too, is there's a lot of negative that's come from this pandemic. But when we think about what the positive is, I keep thinking about the resilience that we can help build in our children right now, that there is this recognition that things don't at all always go the way we want them to. And there have been so many losses this year, and different, events that they've wanted to attend and that they haven't been able to. And yet I sort of look forward to a couple of years from now when we can look back and say, hey, but we survived that, and it might not have been great, but we learned some really great skills in the meantime to help us recognize that we can get through hard times. How do we know when when a child is struggling, whether that is just sort of, okay, that's a bit of a hard time right now, but there's nothing in terms of next steps we need to do, versus, hey, they're actually really having a hard time with attention, with symptoms that might be consistent with depression or anxiety. And they really do potentially need more support. How do you help tease that apart, since everyone is struggling to some degree right now?
So, and I agree. I think there's a different level of symptomology. And I think at any point that you have a question, reaching out to a school psychologist, school social worker, clinical psychologist, clinical social worker, even a pediatrician is important. But I do think you should be more alarmed as children become more disengaged, especially with things that they enjoyed traditionally. Things that they could enjoy during this COVID outbreak is things like Minecraft and all those different online games I get to hear about when I meet with students. And then all of a sudden they don't care and they don't want to take part of it. So that, I think, watch for that. Watch for extreme irritability. Watch for emotional breakdowns where children are just crying out of the blue, where there really is no reason. You ask them to go to bed and all of a sudden they're just crying. Though, if they need more than just a little support there, reach out to somebody else that might know them or have children. And this is a time that you reach out to see if it's normal or not. All of a sudden giving away their possessions, they're not interested in those possessions anymore. And one of these sticks out to me, is self-harm. If they're picking it at scabs, they're picking at cuts, or they're creating that, I think it's important that you have a discussion with them, and this is something to get another person's opinion on that's outside of the family. It's okay to get a global perspective.
Yeah, no, that does all make perfect sense, and particularly from a social and emotional standpoint, what you're describing. And I guess what I would add to that too is more from like an attention and learning perspective. Something else that I talk to families about a lot is the timeline, where everybody is struggling a little bit right now. And if these challenges that you're observing are brand new challenges specific to COVID times and remote learning, then it feels as though it's sort of a symptom of the pandemic itself, if we will, and the impact that it's having more broadly. Whereas other families are telling me, actually, these are things we've had concerns about for a long time. And teachers have commented about it in the past, and other members of our family or whatever it may be, and now they feel really exacerbated. And that to me is also an indication, when there has really been some of that trend historically, that there really may be more going on here, as opposed to just feeling like somebody's falling behind academically, which is kind of par for the course, I think, to a certain degree now, and we want to recognize that.
Yeah, and we want everyone to be successful. So you're right, it's par for the course, and there are some things, like you said, some flexibility. Is it realistic for me to expect, perfection right now, or a lot of learning right now with everything else that's going on? Because we haven't even included, like, people have family members that are sick, or they're worried about things like that. But I think that you had brought up an excellent point, and it's something that I think about when clients come to me is, did this exist prior to COVID? If it did, I have more concern than if it's during COVID. Although with anxiety and depression, I don't have less or more. I look at the symptomology and the degree at which they impact a person's life at that point. But yeah, I totally agree. Was it around beforehand? Because if it was, that's a long-term concern.
Yep, definitely. And in those cases, certainly as a private provider, I would say, from our end, we are always happy to have people reach out. I have lots of friends and colleagues in the field who are psychologists that do therapy and assessments, and social workers and a variety of different providers. school's end, where would you typically have a family reach out first if they are concerned with their
Sure.
child's well-being, either from the learning attention side or from a social emotional
So
side?
I always ask families to reach out to the teacher first. The teacher knows the student better than the school psychologist or school social worker or principal. They also have knowledge of a student and access to other teachers to find out, is this something that was occurring last year? Is this something that's new? They can also talk about what your child might be like during the synchronous learning when you might not be in the room, because children act different ways with different people. So that's important. They also have access to connect you to the right person. You can, but that doesn't mean you can't reach out to a school psychologist or a school social worker. In the building that I'm in, I always recommend contacting the school social worker first. But they are always welcome to contact me, especially if I know their child or I have history with their family and I'm familiar with them. And we'll make sure you get to the right person. So don't feel bad about calling the wrong person. You might ultimately want the school nurse, and we'll connect you to that person. And that's the important part, is you connect with someone familiar first and go from there. And the teachers know how to get a hold of the support staff very quickly. Everyone's working overtime right now. Everyone is trying to be aware of all of these things while they're teaching. And they're probably talking more now than ever about student social emotional health and social emotional learning, so that we're not missing students that might need our assistance, where it might be impacting school. Now, if it's something that only impacts at home, that's when reach out to other people that you're familiar with. I know I have a list of providers in the area. If a parent were to call me, I'd say, here, let me send you the list. So you don't have to go finding people. But it's important to reach out and feel like you're not isolated.
So tell me, what have been some of the strategies that you've offered to your students or your families who are finding it just particularly hard to get back in the groove of academics, to really engage in their studies effectively?
Yeah, I have found a lot of times families are falling out of the groove altogether, where they've created a whole new schedule or lack of schedule, because they're just trying to get everybody from wake up to bedtime. And they're trying to get everything done in between. And one of the things I've learned in my practice is that the sooner you can normalize things and return to normalcy, the better off you are. And there are things that you can do at home that replicate what we do at schools. And at schools, we always have a daily schedule up on the board that's visible for students throughout the school day. At home, I would do the same thing. I would hope a lot of teachers are posting that, but if they're not, you can always email the teacher and find out, what is the schedule for the day? I want to print it out and put it on my child's desk so they can check off as they're done with things. Or they can write on there when they get their homework assignment in real time. Not everything has to be digital. I like to refer to everything as tech, low tech versus high tech. And tech is good. So laminating a sheet of paper or even just replacing the sheet of paper every day with the schedule is great. And in a separate place, you can have the family schedule. So when they're done with school, they can then see the family schedule. The other thing that I highly recommend is getting dressed for school. Go through the normal routine that you would go through if your child was at one of your local schools.
For sure.
Get them up at the same time. Don't be getting them up 5 minutes before school starts on Zoom. Get them up at the normal time. Have your normal morning conversations. Have your normal breakfast. Make sure they're getting out of their PJs and into something that makes them feel like they're ready for the day. Schedule showers, bath time, the same way as you had before. I think all of that is very important.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And one thing that's so highly correlated with all of that too, especially with our ability to attend and engage, is proper sleep hygiene, making sure they're actually getting enough sleep, which I know was something that really had fallen by the wayside a lot at the beginning of the pandemic, and kids didn't have regular bedtimes anymore and were staying up too late, and everything was just sort of without any kind of structure.
Yeah.
And I think that makes it a much more difficult setup for really being able to be engaged throughout the day. So really keeping that regular bedtime as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I feel like we could talk for many hours longer, but unfortunately Our time here is coming to an end. Eric, thank you so much for joining me. I really
you're most welcome.
Your time and your expertise and all the work you're doing to help support our community. And thank you to the viewers for tuning in. You can find these Catch conversations as well as a wealth of other resources on our website, catchiscommunity.org, and on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
One important thing that I've learned is you have to connect what you see with what you hear. So I actually think Zoom is a great thing for kids because not only do they hear the voices of their friends or their parents talking about their friends, but they actually get to see them online and connect what their parents are telling them. When you tell them everyone's okay, your friends are fine, they need to see it for themselves, and they need to see it on Zoom.
I'm hearing a lot about cognitive flexibility there. I think we've really all had to adjust so much to find new ways to problem solve and to come up with different, strategies to get through certain times. And I think it really has empowered us all to recognize that we don't have to be stuck in one specific way and that there are alternative means of getting through these different things.
For updated information on our mental health programming, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our Facebook page, follow us on Instagram, or find us at catchiscommunity.org. Catch is dedicated to making a difference in our community through empowering families to raise resilient and independent youth.